Wait, so it's going to be either one for one or all for all. So not like the Three Musketeers, huh? Yeah, if you gotta ask, yeah. November 4th, 1951. There is always censorship in wartime, right? To one degree or another, usually based on what sort of government and press the country in question has. Here in the Korean War, we've now reached an interesting point, a point where the communist press is less censored than the Allied one. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, there was minimal action in the field. UN Commander Matt Ridgway held a rare press conference, and the big news was the resumption of peace talks now held in the tiny village of Panmunjom. Those talks are still the big news this week. I said that the communist side was sort of losing interest in the discussions because of the unyielding UN insistence that they must have Kaesong. Well, after a few days of fruitless discussion at the end of last week and the start of this one, the communists propose a 4-kilometer demilitarized zone based on current line of contact, keeping Kaesong in their orbit. They say this is their best and final proposal. Ridgway has thought that the UN map proposal from last week, roughly along the current battle lines, was their final offer, with maybe minor adjustments. But the powers that be tell him again that the absolute minimum position must maintain the security of the Kansas line. The Joint Chiefs of Staff cabled Ridgway to say that he had got the wrong impression. No one, not even Ridgway himself, had earlier agreed that the UN team should insist on gaining Kaesong. The Joint Chiefs concluded, "We recognize that it is difficult for a field commander to surrender hard-earned ground, and do not consider that you should do so unless negotiations seem likely to fail on an issue which does not involve our minimum position. In sum, be flexible, forget about Kaesong." Ridgway really thinks the enemy is seriously hurt and wants an armistice badly. So these instructions to him are at worst a betrayal, but at best pretty weak and vacillating. He waits a couple days, then finally issues new orders on the 2nd, yielding somewhat on the Kaesong issue. He says the UN delegates are authorized to now put Kaesong inside the demilitarized zone if the other side agrees to the UN's proposed adjustments to the line in central and eastern Korea, and to have the UN's outpost line of resistance on the west bank of the Imjin River. The two sides spend the next 2 days arguing about this, but the communists do not change their mind about keeping control of Kaesong. Today, the 4th, Ridgway and Chief UN Delegate Turner Joy have decided that a settlement based on the current battle line, with minor adjustments, is pretty much the best that they can hope to get. I want to talk a bit about something that may well become a major issue in the talks, and something that there's been much discussion about in both sides' high commands pretty much the entire war: the repatriation of POWs. Article 19 of the 1949 Geneva Convention begins with this: prisoners of war shall be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of hostilities. That seems pretty straightforward. And the US signed the convention, and the North Korean foreign minister said not long after this war began that his government would abide by it. So what's the problem? Well, difficulties arose at the outset of the discussions on the exchange of prisoners and steadily mounted as the issue became surcharged with emotional elements. A series of conflicts broke out between the rights of the individual and those of the majority, between human rights and legal rights, and between humanitarianism and Communist Party pride. There is, for example, a big issue about the general principle of voluntary repatriation. In other words, each individual prisoner can choose whether he wants to go home or not. For the US, there's some history of that going back to the Revolutionary War and the 1783 Treaty of Paris. It says, all prisoners on both sides shall be set at liberty. So because of this, thousands of British and German soldiers from the losing side decided to stay in the new United States rather than go back to Europe. This, however, was not exactly commonplace. The standard practice by the 1900s was just to exchange everyone. And the 1929 Geneva Convention assumes compulsory repatriation. It assumes the large majority of prisoners would want to go home as soon as possible after a war. However, post-World War II, the USSR hung on to, and in some cases is still hanging on to here in 1951, an awful lot of German and Japanese prisoners. That may be a big part of why the 1949 Geneva Convention says repatriated without delay. Every POW gets sent home and sent home as soon as possible. That, however, does ignore a whole bunch of individuals who may, for example, be afraid to go back home because they have fallen afoul of their home government and would be imprisoned or executed should they do so, or those who just prefer to live under their captor system. They just maybe like it better. This really has become an issue as the war got going. The communist side from the get-go re-educated as many captured South Korean troops as they could to get them into the KPA, the North Korean army. Then, after the Incheon landings last year, when the UN forces were advancing northward and taking loads of KPA prisoners, they got a lot of former South Korean soldiers in the process. These guys said they were forced to either join the KPA or face torture or death. So what do you do with these guys? Geneva says you gotta send them back north, but they don't want to go back north. There's even an added twist when the Chinese joined the war in force last October. If you watched our episodes about the Chinese Civil War on our Time Goes History channel, you'll know there were a lot of desertions and surrenders late in the war from the Chinese nationalists to the Chinese communists. And there are many thousands of former nationalist soldiers now serving with the PVA, the Chinese fighting in Korea. Many of these guys are completely disenchanted with communist China and have a marked lack of enthusiasm for being sent back under communist control. That was such a wrinkle that just before the peace talks first began in July, Robert McClure, the U.S. Army Chief of Psychological Warfare, specifically spoke up about his concerns over what would happen to the former nationalist troops that are now POWs should the two sides sign an armistice in Korea. A lot of these guys say they were forced to join the PVA, and they may well face stiff penalties or even execution should they be sent back to communist China, merely for surrendering to the UN forces. McClure's solution to that is to posit that since most of those guys would rather go to Taiwan, where the nationalist government is holed up, and since Taiwan can be considered part of China, then these guys should be sent there. This might even have the psychological effect that in future, other such soldiers might be more likely to surrender, knowing they would not be sent back to communist China. U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins says he supports this and was actually willing to go one step further. If it didn't affect the speedy recovery of UN prisoners held by the enemy, no Chinese or North Korean prisoners should be forced to go back to communist-controlled territory without their full consent. But while McClure's Taiwan idea could maybe be squared with the Geneva stipulations, Collins' expansion of the idea could not, as Ridgway pointed out when asked for his thoughts on the matter. He also said that adopting voluntary repatriation now might come back to bite the U.S. in future wars. In spite of all of that, though, he did not think it was a bad idea in general. The Joint Chiefs Senior Advisory Group, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee, supports this too, but maintains that it is beyond a military matter and should be handled at the governmental level. And any final approval should come from the UN's General Assembly. Reuben Jenkins, the Army's G3, or Operations Chief, was very much opposed to this since he figured the General Assembly would not make a decision on basic policy. The Joint Chiefs say, maybe you're right, so tell Ridgway to develop the position on voluntary repatriation for planning purposes. But, complicated. After the talks broke down, things changed a bit. Robert Lovett succeeded George Marshall September 17th as Secretary of Defense, and he wrote a memo in late September pointing out the communist side might refuse to negotiate on a one-for-one prisoner release and might demand an all-for-all exchange. This put a damper on things. See, the primary UN consideration is the speedy return of all UN personnel held by the other side. If the exchange is one-for-one, then the UN can hold back enemy POWs who don't want to go back to communist rule until all the UN prisoners are safely back, and then send them wherever, because the UN side has a lot more enemy POWs than the communist side does. But if it's all for all, then this scheme would be ruined. In October, though, Jenkins counseled Collins to accept an all-for-all POW exchange should the enemy refuse to agree to anything else. Since Ridgway's armistice instructions were about to be revised in preparation for the resumption of the truce talks, and since voluntary repatriation was contrary to the Geneva Convention anyway, the Army G3 did not think that the principle should be reaffirmed. Collins and his JCS colleagues agreed. I'll have more to say about this in the near future. I'd like to say a few words about censorship now. There was a good deal of dissatisfaction at the time among Allied correspondents. The military command had been giving the correspondents as little news as possible. Its delegates were living behind a little iron curtain of their own, and Allied correspondents were beginning to depend on what they could glean from the two English-speaking correspondents on the other side, Alan Winnington of the London Daily Worker and Wilfred Burchett, an Australian reporting for the leftist Ce Soir of Paris. Seriously, the UN reporters are turning to the communist ones to get the story, since they are often unable to get it from their own military. There is a cable sent by Marguerite Higgins from Panmunjom to the New York Herald Tribune, which pretty much breaks the story of Allied press relations. At the noon recess in the truce negotiations, Allied officials, whom Allied newspapermen are not permitted to approach, stalk off to their helicopters, which fly them back to the base camp. This, in turn, is surrounded by barbed wire and military policemen, and no newspaperman is permitted to enter without being officially invited or under officer escort. UN liaison officers attending the truce talks are forbidden to speak to the press. The press covering the talks are given but one briefing a day by a general officer not present at the talks themselves. This comes at the end of the day, so at the noon break, the Allied correspondents get information from their counterparts on the other side. Ms. Higgins writes, "The communist briefings have been quite accurate and more informative than the Allied evening briefings." She actually knows Wilfred Burchett and says that at noon, he gets to talk to the communist liaison officers and then fills her and her colleagues in on what happened in the morning talks. Talks that will hopefully end the war, but the fight in the field goes on. Remember the Commonwealth Division took the important position Maryang-san a few weeks ago during Operation Commando? Well, today, as the week ends, the Chinese attack to try and take it back. According to Michael Hickey in the Korean War, they even have a banner which reads, "Go home, Britishers, or this hill will be your graveyard." The UN forces call in napalm airstrikes on the Chinese, Australian Sea Furies from carrier HMAS Sydney and South African land-based Mustangs. But this does not stop the enemy attack, which is preceded by a tremendous artillery barrage directed at the King's Own Scottish borderers on the position called the Hinge. The attackers have managed to dig to within meters of the KOSB defenses, and they overwhelm Company C, who have bolt-action rifles that are not the most useful weapons for close-quarter fighting. That position falls, as does Hill 217, and then the fight for Maryang-san goes on into the night. Eventually, sheer weight of numbers tells in the Chinese favor, and the Commonwealth forces evacuate the position. I imagine there will be some sort of counterattack next week, which I shall cover then, for this week of the war has reached its conclusion, with that action beginning and the peace talks continuing, but still not achieving anything concrete. I can see the POW thing becoming yet another sticking point should they get past the current one. That's gotta be tough, you know? Imagine being a Chinese nationalist soldier, first fighting the Japanese in World War II, then fighting in the Civil War, captured by the communists and joining their army rather than being killed, and then, after that war is over, being sent to fight in this one as a volunteer against a completely different army, captured again, and then what? Being sent back to communist China and execution or prison, being sent to Taiwan where you've never been and where your family isn't, being just let out in either North or South Korea where you don't know anyone and don't speak the language. For a lot of people, surviving the war is only the beginning of their problems. Fortunately for us here at Time Ghost, our biggest problem is just continuing this coverage until the war ends. You can join us in that endeavor when you join the Time Ghost Army, which you can do at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Kieran Lucky, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, is the Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.